I grew up on a pumpkin farm in a quiet rural town, the kind of place where the wind rustles the cornfields and the silence of the night feels like a living thing. My parents ran the farm, an expansive piece of land that stretched out across flat plains and rolled gently towards the woods. It had rows of pumpkins, from small, round ones to huge, knotted gourds that could barely fit in a wheelbarrow. Each year, people from all around the county would come to pick their pumpkins for Halloween. And each year, it seemed, the farm became more popular. But there was one thing about our farm that always unsettled me. The scarecrow. It had been there for as long as I could remember, buried deep within the pumpkin patch, so tangled in vines and weeds that if you didn't know it was there, you'd easily miss it. Its face, if you could call it that, was a burlap sack stuffed with straw, sewn crudely with mismatched stitches. Its eyes were black pits, buttons that had faded into something more sinister over the years. And its smile, gosh, the smile, was a crooked line that curved too far up its face, making it look like it knew something horrible that you didn't. The way the vines curled around its wooden arms made it look more alive than any scarecrow had the right to be. I always got the impression that it was watching, even though I told myself that was ridiculous. It was hidden so well behind the thick foliage that you really had to search to find it. But I could always feel it, like it was waiting for something, or maybe just watching me. It had always been part of the farm's eerie charm. Every Halloween season, visitors would wander through the rows of pumpkins, laughing and pointing at the odd shapes, unaware of the thing lurking in the shadows. My parents would smile and sell pumpkins by the pound, while I roamed around, making sure kids didn't run off with anything. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of the scarecrow as I passed, just the top of its head poking out from the vines. Each time, a shiver would crawl up my spine, but I never let on. After all, it was just a scarecrow, wasn't it? On a particular fall afternoon, the sun was low in the sky, casting a deep orange hue over the fields, making everything look dreamlike. The farm was busy, with families meandering through the pumpkin patch, picking their favorite gourds to carve into jack-o'-lanterns. My parents were at the stand, chatting with customers, while I wandered the rows, keeping an eye out for anyone who might need help, or worse, someone looking to steal a pumpkin. That's when I saw her, a little girl, no older than 6 or 7, wandering away from her parents, her eyes wide with curiosity. She was slowly making her way toward the scarecrow, her small hands brushing the tall grass as she walked. I froze when I saw her heading in that direction. Something inside me tensed, like a tight knot twisting in my gut. The scarecrow. I didn't know why, but the thought of anyone getting too close to it made my skin crawl. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. The girl stopped in her tracks and looked at me, confused. "Don't touch that. It's fragile." That was a lie. The scarecrow wasn't fragile. Not even close. In fact, I had no idea what it was made of under those vines, but it looked like it had been standing there for decades. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad would happen if she got too close. She tilted her head, her brow furrowed. "Why?" It's old. You might break it," I said, my words stumbling out. The girl stared at me for a moment longer, then nodded and walked away, her attention quickly shifting to another pumpkin. I breathed a sigh of relief, though I wasn't entirely sure why. It wasn't like the scarecrow could hurt her, could it? Not long after, the wind began to pick up. At first, it was a gentle breeze, rustling the leaves and making the vines sway. But then, without warning, it intensified, howling through the pumpkin patch like a wild animal. The front door of the house slammed open, even though I could have sworn we had locked it. I rushed toward the porch to close it, fighting against the wind, confused as to how such a strong gust could come out of nowhere. As soon as I managed to pull the door shut, I heard a scream. It wasn't a playful, excited scream, like the ones you often heard from kids running through the fields. No, this was different. It was filled with terror. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. A woman was standing at the edge of the pumpkin patch, her face pale, her hands clutching at her mouth in horror. "My daughter! Someone took my daughter!" Panic surged through me, my stomach lurching as I tried to comprehend what she was saying. The girl, the same girl who had wandered toward the scarecrow, was gone. Without thinking, I glanced over toward the scarecrow's spot, my breath catching in my throat. It was gone. The vines that had wrapped around its body were torn apart, like something had ripped free of them. The patch where it had stood was empty, the ground disturbed, and the burlap face, the twisted, stitched face, was nowhere to be seen. The woman's voice trembled as she pointed toward the cornfield that stretched out beyond the pumpkin patch. "It took her into the corn. I saw it. A dark figure. Oh gosh, please, someone help." I didn't think. I just ran. The cornfield was dense, taller than I remembered, and as I plunged into it, the wind seemed to vanish, leaving only an eerie, oppressive silence. My pulse pounded in my ears as I pushed through the stalks, my hands trembling with each step. The further I went, the darker it became, the tall cornstalks blocking out the fading light. I could barely see a few feet ahead of me, and every time I paused, I could hear the faintest rustling sound, like something was moving just out of sight. I called out the girl's name, my voice cracking with fear, but the only response was the sound of shuffling leaves and the occasional gust of wind that seemed to come from nowhere. I felt like I was walking in circles, the rows of corn all blending together in a disorienting maze. My mind raced with thoughts of what could have taken her, who, or worse, what? Then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard it. Laughter. I stopped dead in my tracks, the sound sending a chill down my spine. It wasn't a sinister laugh. It was the light, playful giggle of a child. I followed the sounds, pushing through the thick stalks until I found her. The little girl was sitting in a small clearing, surrounded by cornstalks, her back to me. She was laughing softly, her shoulders shaking with amusement. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a cold sense of dread. "Hey," I called out, my voice hoarse. "Are you okay?" She turned slowly to face me, her eyes wide and innocent, a bright smile on her face. "I made a new friend," she said, her voice matter-of-fact, as though nothing was wrong. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Who took you? Where's the figure?" She blinked at me, confused. "Nobody took me. I just wanted to explore." My mind was racing. The woman had seen something. She had screamed, panicked, saying a dark figure had snatched her daughter. But now the girl was sitting here, calm, as if nothing had happened, as if everything had been a lie. But it wasn't. I knew what I saw. Something wasn't right. I hurried the girl back to her mother, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. The woman hugged her daughter, tears in her eyes, asking over and over what had happened. But the girl just kept saying she'd been playing, that she hadn't been taken. As my parents arrived to take over, I turned back toward the scarecrow's spot. My breath caught in my throat. It was back. The scarecrow stood there, as though it had never moved, its wooden arms stretched out awkwardly, its head tilted slightly to the side. The vines were still wrapped around its legs, though they seemed more disturbed than before, as if something had struggled free of them. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. Had it moved? Could it have moved? Or was I just imagining things? I took a hesitant step forward, then another. I needed to know. I needed to be sure. When I reached the scarecrow, I stood there, staring up at its face. The crooked smile seemed even more twisted now, more knowing. I felt a cold sweat drip down my back as I leaned in closer, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. For a moment, everything was still. The wind had stopped. The sounds of the farm faded into the background. It was just me and the scarecrow, locked in some silent, terrible standoff. And then it happened. One of its arms twitched. I stumbled back, my heart leaping into my throat. I hadn't imagined it. The scarecrow had moved. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. I used to live in a house that felt alive in all the wrong ways. It wasn't the creaks or groans of old wood settling in the night. nor the whispers of the wind through drafty windows. No, what haunted me were the bugs. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They showed up out of nowhere, like some twisted magic trick that only left me with disgust and dread. I had never liked bugs, not since I was a child. Something about the way they moved, so alien and unpredictable, sent shivers down my spine. The worst part was that these weren't your ordinary house pests. They weren't just ants or flies or even spiders. They were strange, too strange. I would find them in the oddest places, underneath my pillow, crawling up the side of my bathtub, or skittering across the kitchen counter in broad daylight. The insects were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Some of them were a little too big, their legs twitching unnaturally as they crawled. Others had bizarre colors and patterns that I couldn't place. Some looked like they had too many legs, while others seemed to pulse, their bodies swelling and deflating as though they were breathing. It was as if nature had made a mistake, and these bugs were its failed experiments, hiding away in my house. The worst part? They were impossible to kill. Oh, you could crush them, sure, but it was disgusting. They didn't just squash like a normal bug. Their bodies seemed to explode, releasing this foul, acrid-smelling goo that was thick and sticky. It took forever to clean up, and every time I killed one, I swore it felt like a million more would take its place. No matter what I did, pest control, traps, poisons, nothing worked. Every time I thought I was rid of them, they'd come back, stronger, like they were taunting me. I became obsessed. I tried everything, sealing every crack and crevice in the house, covering drains, even sleeping with the lights on, hoping the brightness would keep them at bay. But they always found a way in, and they always seemed to be there, lurking just out of sight until I wasn't looking. And then, one night, I snapped. It had been a long day at work, the kind that drains the life out of you, and all I wanted to do was collapse in bed and sleep. But when I walked into my room, I saw one of the bugs, a big one, just sitting there on my pillow, staring at me with those awful black eyes. I had no idea how it had gotten there, but it felt like the last straw. Something inside me broke. I screamed, loud and angry, grabbing a shoe and smashing it over and over until nothing was left but a smear of guts and shattered shell. I was done. I couldn't take it anymore. That's when I heard it. At first it was faint, like a distant whisper of rain on a roof. But as I stood there, trying to calm myself, it grew louder. It was the unmistakable sound of something crawling. No, lots of somethings crawling. A wave of panic washed over me, and I froze, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. It sounded like hundreds of tiny legs skittering over each other, coming from below me, from the basement. I didn't want to go down there. The very thought made my skin crawl, but the noise was growing louder, and I knew if I didn't do something, it would drive me mad. I had to know what was making that sound. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the basement door, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached for the handle, my hand trembled. I could hear the sound more clearly now, a constant chittering, like a swarm of something terrible just beyond the door. I swallowed hard, every instinct in me screaming to turn back, to forget about it, to leave the house altogether. But I had to know. I had to get rid of them once and for all. With a deep breath, I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The noise stopped instantly. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the sound. My heart was racing as I shined the flashlight down the stairs. Nothing. Just an empty basement, the same as it always was. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, trying to convince myself that it had just been my imagination, that maybe I was hearing the house settle or the wind outside. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I spun the flashlight toward it, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the far corner of the basement, where the light barely reached, something was shifting. At first, I thought it was just a shadow cast by the dim light, but then I saw it. Hundreds, maybe thousands of bugs. They covered the walls, the ceiling, the floor, writhing over each other. A mass of legs and bodies, their shapes blending into one another until they were one moving, pulsating creature. But that wasn't the worst of it. Perched in the center of the mass, looming above them, was something that made my blood run cold. It was the size of a man, easily 6 feet tall, but it wasn't human. It was some kind of grotesque spider, its bloated body covered in thick black hairs, its eyes gleaming like dark marbles in the beam of my flashlight. Its legs, far too long and thin, were planted on top of the pile of insects beneath it, like it was their ruler, their master. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. That's when I felt it, something sticky against my arm. I looked down in horror to see that I had walked straight into a web so thin and so wide that it covered the entire basement. Every movement I made caused the web to tremble, and I knew it. I could feel the spider watching me, its eyes locked on mine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My legs were shaking as the thing began to inch closer, one slow, deliberate step at a time. I tried to pull away, but the web was too strong, too sticky. Every movement only made it worse, made the spider come closer. It was less than a few feet away now, its legs twitching, its body swaying as if it was preparing to strike. I couldn't die here, not like this. Desperate, I spotted something, a pole, maybe a broom or a piece of an old chair, lying on the ground, just a few feet away. With all my strength, I lunged for it, my hand grabbing onto the cold metal as I swung wildly. I didn't even look, just closed my eyes and prayed I would hit it. There was a sickening thud, and for a moment, everything went quiet. I opened my eyes slowly, my hands still trembling. The spider was gone. I scanned the room, my heart still pounding, but I couldn't see it. Had I killed it? I dared to hope for a second that maybe, somehow, I had gotten lucky. But then I heard it, a soft, skittering sound above me. I looked up just in time to see it. The spider had jumped, launching itself across the room in one terrifyingly fast motion. It was on the ceiling now, crawling toward me with an unnatural speed. I barely had time to react before it dropped down, landing just inches from where I stood. I ran. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted up the basement stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I scrambled for the door. I could hear it behind me, its legs tapping against the walls, the floor, as it gave chase. My hands reached the doorknob, and I slammed the door shut just as the spider lunged at it. I stood there, gasping for breath, my body shaking with fear. For a long moment, there was silence. I waited, my ear pressed against the door, listening. But there was nothing. No skittering, no tapping, no sound at all. I called the police. I had to. I didn't know what else to do. When they arrived, I told them everything. Every disgusting detail about the bugs, the web, and the massive spider that had tried to take me out. They didn't believe me, of course. They thought it was some kind of prank or that I was having a breakdown. They went down to the basement, but they didn't find anything. No bugs, no web, no spider. It was like it had never been there at all. I didn't stay in that house after that. I couldn't. I packed up what I could and moved in with a family member, thankful to be free of that nightmare. But the thing that haunts me the most isn't the memory of the bugs or even the spider. It's the fact that I tried to look it up. I wanted to know what kind of spider it was, whether it was some rare species or something new. But I couldn't find anything. No matter how hard I searched, no matter what terms I used, there was no match. That's when I realized something terrifying. Maybe what I saw wasn't just a bug. Maybe it was something else. Something that wasn't meant to be found. Something that didn't belong in this world. And in the dark corners of my mind, I know that it's still out there, still waiting. It started innocently enough. I was at Ryan's place, lounging on his worn-out couch, a half-empty can of soda in my hand, as he, Matt, and Julie tossed around ideas for what we could do that night. Halloween was around the corner, and the chilly October air seemed to amplify the excitement in our voices. Ryan had his laptop open, scrolling through a list of haunted attractions nearby. Then he said it. I hear the new haunted house down at Carson's is insane. They've got this whole creepy clown theme this year. People are saying it's scarier than any of the other haunts. His eyes flicked to me. I froze. The word clown echoed in my mind, a jolt of unease washing over me. Ryan grinned. He knew. They all did. It wasn't a secret that clowns freaked me out. It wasn't a rational fear, but it was real. Ever since I was a kid, those painted faces with exaggerated expressions made my skin crawl. There was something about how they masked true emotions that felt wrong, twisted. Julie smirked. "Oh, come on. It'll be fun. Don't be a baby." Matt joined in. "Yeah, dude, you can't let a little grease paint and big shoes scare you forever. Face your fear, right?" It was 3 against 1, and the peer pressure was intense. I felt myself caving, as I always did with them. "Fine," I muttered. "But if it's as terrifying as you say, I'm bailing." The haunted house stood at the edge of Carson's fairgrounds, looming in the darkness with a facade that resembled a twisted carnival. Strings of dim lights flickered across the entrance, casting distorted shadows across the clown-themed decorations. A grotesque clown face loomed above the door, its mouth wide open, as if to swallow whoever dared to enter. I could feel my pulse quickening as we approached. The laughter and screams of those exiting the haunted house filled the air. I kept my eyes on the ground, trying to shut out the garish, grinning clown faces plastered on every sign. Ryan slapped me on the back. "Last chance to chicken out, man," he said with a playful nudge. Julie laughed. "Too late now. He's coming with us." We got our tickets, and a worker dressed as a sinister clown ushered us to the entrance. His costume wasn't terrifying, just the typical bright colors and a rubber nose. But as we stepped inside, the air grew cold, and the murmur of the crowd outside faded, replaced by eerie carnival music that drifted through the dimly lit corridors. It was maybe 5 minutes into the house when I saw it for the first time. We had just entered a narrow hallway lined with funhouse mirrors that distorted our reflections, elongating and twisting our bodies in grotesque ways. There it was, at the far end of the hall, a clown, different from the others we'd seen. It wore a faded dirt street costume, the colors once bright, but now dulled to lifeless shades of red and yellow. Its face paint was cracked and smudged, as though hastily applied years ago and left untouched. The eyes were the worst, smeared with dark, uneven rings that gave the illusion of hollow sockets. It stared at me without blinking. My friends laughed and moved on, but I lingered for a moment, unable to tear my eyes away. The clown didn't speak, didn't move. It simply watched me. "Hey, are you coming?" Matt's voice broke through my trance, and I quickly caught up. As we turned the corner into the next room, I glanced back. The clown was gone. As we ventured deeper, the rooms became more chaotic. Animatronic clowns popped out from behind corners, cackling with mechanical laughter. One room was filled with mannequin clowns, arranged in a circle like they were playing some sick version of Duck Duck Goose. My nerves were frayed, but I kept telling myself it was just a show, that none of this was real. But then I saw it again. The same horrifying clown from the hallway. This time, it was much closer, standing just a few feet away, peering out from behind a curtain. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't say anything. It didn't laugh or shout like the other actors. It just stared at me, its head cocked slightly to the side. I turned to tell my friends, but they were already moving ahead, lost in the noise and flashing lights of the next room. When I looked back, the clown had moved, stepping further out from behind the curtain. It was following me. I picked up my pace, my heart pounding. We moved through a maze of corridors, each one filled with crazy decorations and eerie music. The other clowns were a blur, their painted faces and flashing lights barely registering. All I could think about was the silent clown, its gaunt face and hollow eyes. Every time I looked over my shoulder, it was there, always a few steps behind, lurking just out of reach. It never made a sound, never tried to jump scare me like the others. That was what terrified me the most. The quiet way it stalked me, as though it had all the time in the world. At one point, I felt its presence growing stronger, closer. I spun around, ready to confront it, but there was nothing behind me. Just an empty corridor lined with old carnival posters. I caught up with my friends in a room filled with fog and strobe lights. Clowns with spinning eyes and insane smiles stumbled out of the mist, but they were just actors. I kept looking around, scanning the shadows for that one clown. "Guys," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a clown in here that's been following me. I swear it's not part of the show." Julie raised an eyebrow. "They're all part of the show, man. That's the whole point." "No," I insisted, my voice rising. "This one is different. It doesn't act like the others. It just follows me." Ryan chuckled. "Someone's getting a little too into it." I shook my head, frustration boiling in my chest. I wasn't imagining things. There was something wrong with that clown. We moved into a larger room, styled to look like a decrepit circus tent. The air was thick with the scent of damp fabric and cheap fog machines. I spotted more clowns here, grinning, hunched over, waiting to leap out at the right moment. But that clown, the silent one, wasn't among them. At least, not at first. We made our way across the room, and I started to feel a slight bit of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe I was just paranoid. Then, through the mist, I spotted it. It was standing in the middle of the room, staring directly at me. Its hollow eyes seemed darker than before, the makeup smeared as if it had been crying. And then, just like that, it was gone. I didn't see it move, Didn't hear any footsteps. It simply vanished. I bolted for the exit, sprinting ahead of my friends. I needed to get out. The path seemed to stretch forever, a maze of twisting corridors, fake cobwebs, and garish clown faces. As I ran, other clowns appeared. They tried to scare me, jumping out with sudden bursts of laughter or distorted screams. But they weren't the same. They didn't have that eerie silence or those dead eyes. I stumbled into the final room, an exit at the far end within reach. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that one clown following me. But there were only the other clowns, milling about. I burst through the exit, gasping for air. Outside, I was shaking. The cool night air did nothing to soothe my nerves as I found my friends, who had come out behind me, laughing and joking about the experience. "You guys didn't see it?" I demanded. "The clown that kept following me." Julie gave me a concerned look. "What clown?" "The one with the cracked face paint and hollow eyes." I was almost yelling. It wasn't like the others. Matt frowned, glancing at Ryan. "Dude, there's no clown like that in the house. We've been to this one a few times before." Ryan nodded. "Yeah, the clowns are all actors from the local theater group. They didn't use any that look like what you're describing." My blood ran cold. I felt an icy grip tightening around my chest as the words sank in. If that clown wasn't part of the attraction, then who or what had I seen? I had been looking forward to Halloween all month. Each year, I made it a tradition to transform my front porch into a welcoming beacon for trick-or-treaters. I put out jack-o'-lanterns with gnarled, grinning faces, draped fake cobwebs over the porch railing, and set up a spooky soundtrack of eerie howls and ghostly whispers. The candy bowl was filled to the brim with chocolate bars, gummies, and sour candies of every kind. I like to think I was the house that all the neighborhood kids looked forward to visiting. The first knock came just after sunset, a small rap on the door that made me smile. I opened it to find a group of young children standing on my porch, their costumes a colorful blend of princesses, superheroes, and skeletons. I dropped generous handfuls of candy into their bags and listened to their cheerful chorus of thank you before they scampered off to the next house. I watched them for a moment, feeling that familiar warmth of nostalgia. This was what Halloween was all about: innocent fun, silly costumes, and sweet treats. More children came in waves, all dressed in various costumes, from the adorable to the classic. Witches with crooked hats, tiny vampires with plastic fangs, and even a dinosaur or two. I enjoyed seeing the creativity and the excitement in their eyes, savoring the spirit of the holiday. But as the night wore on, the nature of the trick-or-treaters began to shift. The children were replaced by older teenagers who were far too tall for their costumes. The first one that gave me a pause was a boy who looked about 17. He wore a cheap vampire costume, but there was something off about him. His pale face wasn't painted on. His eyes seemed to glow. He grinned at me, showing teeth that looked like real fangs instead of the plastic ones I would have expected. "Happy Halloween," I said, reaching into the candy bowl. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, his grin slowly fading into a blank expression. When I dropped a candy bar into his bag, he whispered, "You shouldn't have opened the door." My hand froze for a moment as I met his gaze. It was the tone of his voice, the eerie way he spoke, that sent a shiver down my spine. I forced a polite smile and watched him walk away, his footsteps making no sound on the pavement. I tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to a teenager trying to be creepy. The knocks on the door continued, and each time I answered, it seemed the costumes grew stranger. There was a girl whose face was obscured by a mask that looked like a human face stitched together. It was too detailed, almost grotesquely lifelike. When I handed her candy, she tilted her head at me and asked, "How much would you pay for your life?" Her voice was soft, and the way she said it made my skin crawl. "What?" I stammered, not sure if I had heard her correctly. "Never mind," she said with a faint giggle, and then she turned and skipped down the walkway, her laughter echoing in the night air. I closed the door and told myself it was just Halloween. I took a deep breath. Some people really got into the spirit, and teenagers were always known for trying to scare people. At least around my neighborhood. That was the point of the night, wasn't it? Still, I couldn't help but feel unnerved by the way they looked at me, as if they weren't just playing a role. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread and continued handing out candy. But then, things got even stranger. One knock was louder than the others, a heavy thud that rattled the door. When I opened it, I was greeted by a tall figure in a black robe. The robe was frayed, and the fabric seemed to ripple in the breeze, even though the air was still. The person wore a mask that resembled a gaping skull. But it wasn't the mask that unsettled me. It was the eyes. They were glowing a dim, sickly yellow, like two dying embers flickering deep within the hollow sockets. "Trick or treat," the figure said, in a voice that was too deep, almost guttural. Happy Halloween," I replied, dropping candy into the sack. The person didn't leave right away. They stood there, staring at me, the glow in their eyes pulsing slightly. It felt like they were looking right through me. I shifted uneasily on my feet. "I think that's enough candy for you," I said, attempting to sound lighthearted. The figure finally turned and walked away, but as they left, I thought I heard them whisper, "We'll be back." I shut the door quickly, my hands shaking. There was something wrong tonight. I glanced at the candy bowl. It was starting to look empty. I could feel a sense of relief at the idea that the night might be winding down. The sooner I could lock the doors and turn off the lights, the better. I was about to take down the decorations when another knock came. This one wasn't loud, but it was steady, persistent. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. The figure standing before me made my breath catch in my throat. It was another teenager, I thought, but the costume was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was a monstrous, grotesque form, covered in dark scales that seemed to shimmer in the porch light. The face, I don't even know if it was a mask. It looked so real, the skin wrinkled and twisted, with jagged teeth that jutted out from a mouth that seemed too wide. The eyes glowed a deep red, the way coals do in a dying fire. It was as if they were alive, burning with some terrible intent. I'm out of candy, I stammered, my voice trembling as I backed away slightly. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I ran out. The creature tilted its head, just like the girl with the stitched mask had, and it continued to stare at me. There was a long silence. My mouth went dry, and I could hear my own heart beating in my ears. The thing didn't move, and it didn't say anything. It just kept looking at me with those horrific, glowing eyes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it turned and walked away without a word. But as it reached the end of the walkway, I could have sworn I heard it mutter, "You'll regret it." I slammed the door shut and locked it, my pulse racing. I felt a sudden urge to take down all the decorations, to turn off the lights and pretend I wasn't home. I pulled the jack-o'-lanterns inside, tore down the cobwebs, and turned off the spooky soundtrack that was still playing in the background. The house was quiet now, but my nerves were on edge. I sat on the couch, staring at the front door, half expecting another knock. My imagination was running wild, and every little creak and groan of the house made me jump. I tried to distract myself with the TV, but the noise was too jarring, too loud in the otherwise silent house. I turned it off, preferring the quiet, even though it wasn't any better. Then I heard it, soft, scratching sounds coming from the front door. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. It was faint but unmistakable, like fingernails dragging slowly across the wood. I forced myself to move, inching toward the door and peering through the peephole. There was nothing there, no one on the porch, no trick-or-treaters walking up the path, just darkness. I let out a shaky breath and backed away. Maybe it was a tree branch or a stray animal. I tried to convince myself of that, but deep down, I didn't believe it. The scratching continued intermittently, sometimes from the back of the house, other times from the sides. It was as if someone or something was circling the house. I made sure every door was locked, every window shut tight. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sounds grew louder, turning into soft, barely audible whispers that seemed to come from just outside the walls. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear, but the whispers stopped the moment I tried to listen. Hours seemed to pass, and the noises didn't cease. At one point, I heard a soft thudding, as if something heavy had been dropped on the front porch. I crept toward the door, my heart racing, and looked through the peephole once more. Standing at the edge of the walkway was the dark, monstrous figure with the glowing eyes. It was watching the house, its eyes piercing the darkness like twin beacons of malevolence. I stepped back, my hands trembling uncontrollably. How was it still here? What did it want? Suddenly, the front doorknob rattled, and the front door seemed to press inward as if something was trying to force its way in. I stumbled back, grabbing the nearest object, a decorative bat that hung near the entryway. I held it like a weapon, though I knew it would be useless if the thing actually broke inside. The rattling stopped. In a moment later, there was a soft, mocking knock. I didn't answer. I didn't even breathe. I stood there, paralyzed, waiting for the next sound. But after what felt like an eternity, the noises faded away, leaving only the unsettling silence of the night. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed on the couch, my ears straining to catch any sound, my eyes fixed on the front door. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made my skin crawl. I kept the decorative bat gripped tightly in my hand, even though I knew it was just a cheap Halloween prop, more for show than actual protection. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours, and the darkness outside the windows felt suffocating. I was too scared to even approach the curtains, afraid of what I might see peering in at me. I kept telling myself that morning would come soon, that the daylight would chase away whatever horrors had been haunting me, but the night seemed endless. I knew something had been there, something unnatural. Finally, just as the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The night was over. I still didn't feel safe, but at least the oppressive darkness had lifted. Hope you enjoyed that story, and I'll see you in the next one. See you on the flip side.